Good morning, everyone. My name is Ganiyat Sadiq, and I'm the Advocacy Officer for Justice for All Canada, a nonprofit focused on preventing genocide globally with a consultative role at the United Nations. We are gathered on the unceded, unsurrendered land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin. Today, we are confronted with the harrowing reality of the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the escalating violence in the West Bank. The scenes of destruction, despair, and devastation paint a grim picture of the atrocities that have been unfolding before our eyes for over 153 days. Today, on International Women's Day, it is impossible to ignore the severe complicity of the Canadian government in the suffering and the violence being faced by Palestinian women and children. The gendered impacts of this genocide and the violence are beyond comprehension. Over 8,620 women have been ruthlessly killed. Over 14,350 children have been murdered in Gaza alone, their young lives cut violently short by an incomprehensible ethnic cleansing campaign. Reports of malnutrition and starvation among Gaza's children are a direct consequence of Israel's inhumane restrictions on aid delivery. In the face of such unspeakable suffering, Canada's decision to cut funding to UNRWA is nothing short of reprehensible. This decision not only deprives vulnerable Palestinian women and children of critical services, but also contradicts our nation's humanitarian commitments and priority of empowering women around the world. By reducing support to UNRWA, Canada is complicit in the suffering of Palestinian women and girls, denying them access to essential healthcare and reproductive services. This is not feminism, this is hypocrisy. Today, on this International Day celebrating women across the globe, we condemn in the strongest terms the Canadian government's role in enabling these egregious violations of human rights violations against Palestinian women and children. We demand justice for the countless lives lost, for the future stolen, and for the human dignity that has been trampled upon under the weight of oppression. Our distinguished speakers will be speaking in more detail about the gendered impact of the genocide in Gaza, as well as violence in the West Bank on women and children. I would now like to introduce our first speaker, Monalisa Ghadban, the co-founder and creative director of Films for Palestine, a grassroots initiative focused on raising awareness and fostering dialogue in the community about film, occupation, and Palestinian life.
I'd like to take a moment of silence for our missing and murdered Indigenous women and the victims of residential schools. Today, there isn't much I can say that hasn't been already expressed by global health professionals, NGO heads, journalists, or independent media sources. They have shed light on the dire situation in Gaza. Women's right is an intersectional issue linked to race, class, ethnicity, and more. It has been 154 days, or 6 months and a day, since we witnessed the genocidal barbarism at the hands of Israeli occupational forces. From the beginning, Israel's intention has been to murder, disable, and traumatize Palestinians. Palestinians from all faiths are witnessing the genocide and erasure of our culture, heritage, and identities. As a Palestinian Canadian in diaspora, I find myself grieving the loss of my identity, which each passing day I will never experience Palestine, Jerusalem, where my dad is from, or Ramle, my mother's hometown, and for the continued siege of Palestinian territory. There is widespread famine and malnourishment as long-awaited humanitarian aid trucks are obstructed by extreme right settlers at the Karim Shalom border crossing. These settlers are effectively enabled by IOF and protected by the occupying government, effectively failing to follow any of the ICJ ruling provisions, including unimpeded humanitarian aid and access. We witnessed horrors endured by Palestinian women and girls at the hands of the IFO with the implicit support of our government and their allies, Canada making over $28.5 million in armed sales to Israel since October 23rd, making it actively complicit in the genocide of Palestinians. This is only furthered and the ongoing occupation of home and land in Gaza. The IFO have torn apart families and destroyed homes, even cooking inside abandoned kitchens as a way to dehumanize Palestinians, a reminder of homes they no longer have. In addition to fetishizing Palestinian women's bodies by posting pictures of Gazans' women's undergarments while using derogatory, perverted, and racial slur, robbing Palestinian women of any privacy and being broadcasted to the world for social media to see. Pregnant mothers are forced to flee from their homes from the north to the south of Gaza, dodging unceasing shelling and bombardment, only to have C-sections or births without any kind of anesthesia. This is a daily reality in the barely functioning, unsanitized hospitals in Gaza with little to no aftercare. New mothers are sent to Rafah refugee camps only to watch their newborn children die from starvation. Young children are having their limbs amputated without any type of anesthesia as well. Children expressing suicidal ideations rather than suffering any more pain or hunger. Parents feeling helpless as they watch their children die as well. Children waving white flags in safe passages, unaware of the reason they are compelled to signal surrender. Hala Khalis, a Palestinian grandmother, was murdered in cold blood while a white flag in her hand was raised as she was traveling from designated safe passages. These incidents are not isolated to Gaza, but also affecting Palestinians in the West Bank and Jerusalem. In Khalil, now known as Hebron, last July, Palestinian women in the West Bank were stripped naked while police, dogs, and soldiers looked on. It's not uncommon for Palestinian women to be harassed or forced to be photographed in undesirable situation by IOF in an attempt to dehumanize them. In Israeli arbitrary detention, Palestinian women and girls are subjected to inhuman, degrading treatment, denying basic necessities like food, medicine, and menstrual pads. They are kept in cages, left without food in the rain and cold, and subjected to multiple forms of sexual assault by male Israeli officials. All are violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, all rendered arbitrary, as the true statistics are actually unknown due to the lack of international media access into these prisons. Since October 7th, the increased administration of and detention of children, teenagers in the West Bank and occupied Palestinian territory has risen significantly, further robbing Palestinians of any connection to their land community and leaving them in isolation. In finality, to contest the need for human rights and the reinstatement of UNRWA aid for Gaza is specifically when we're seeing the systemic escalation of Israel's egregious human rights violation and systemic genocide attempts towards Palestinians since 1949, as it was brought up by South Africa's case at the ICJ. Canada is failing in its international obligation to protect international women and girls' rights in its stance in regards to international human rights and law. The largest casualties of this genocide being women and children, targeting Palestinian futures. We cannot dream of a better future or world. We need to be pragmatic with our words and actions towards a free and liberated Palestine. The future of Palestinians and human rights lies in our grassroots mobilization through the boycott, divesting, and sanction movement and our collective actions. As global citizens, we want to decide what our future would entail, not settle for a future that's chosen for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Monalisa. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Lama Alsafi, a Ph.D. student whose research focuses on the question of Palestine and the intersection of politics, policy, conflict resolution, and international law.
Hello. My name is Lama Alsafi. I would like to extend my gratitude to Justice for All Canada for inviting me to speak today. It's my honor to address you today on International Women's Day. Upon winning the 2015 election, and after a decade of rule under Harper's Conservatives, which included a divisive foreign policy and an abandonment of the core international values that Canadians cherish, Justin Trudeau declared, quote, "Many of you have worried that Canada has lost its compassionate and constructive voice in the world over the past 10 years. Well, I have a simple message for you. On behalf of 35 million Canadians, we're back." End quote. To eager Canadians and the international community partners alike, this statement was a much welcomed and important signal of the government's recommitment to Canada's universally recognized foreign policy values and principles, including respect for international law, norms, human rights, and the rules-based international order. And where is Canada today? Nearly a decade later, are we back? Today, Canada is among the most pro-Israel countries in the world and has become an international outlier in the process. But it wasn't always this way. On Palestine, Canada was historically seen as an honest broker and a neutral third party. Canada's hyper-partisan and internationally isolating foreign policy positions on Palestine were largely established under Harper. But rather than making any meaningful effort to reverse Canada's strategic direction, Trudeau has instead cemented these Harper-era positions and more deeply entrenched Canada's place as an international outlier within the international community. Harper's foreign policy positions on Palestine benefited him and his approach to politics. It was a politics of division and fear, characterized by aggressively pro-Israel and anti-UN rhetoric. So what benefit does Trudeau gain from maintaining these Harper-era policy positions? Seemingly, the Canadian government has made the strategic decision that completely surrendering to U.S. foreign policy direction on Palestine is more beneficial than formulating our own independent policy influenced by our traditionally held international values and principles. As a result, a strategy of uncritical and unconditional support for Israel dominates Canadian decision-making on all matters related to Palestine, to the detriment of Canada's international reputation and standing. And where has this led us? Today, Palestinians in Gaza are starving. Hunger has reached catastrophic levels, and over 500,000 people, or a quarter of the population, are one step away from famine. But this is not because the crops have failed, or because of drought, or any other act of nature. This is a choice. It's a cruel, man-made, collective punishment. Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. It's a crime and an intentional act of genocide by Israel against Palestinians, and Canada is complicit. Directly after the U.S., and only hours after the International Court of Justice decision ordering provisional measures against Israel, where the court found that Israel is plausibly committing genocide, Canada cut funding to UNRWA. UNRWA is now and has always been a lifeline for Palestinians. And Canada's decision to cut funding, hours after the ICJ ruling, based on unproven allegations, and during an act of genocide, represents an astounding moral failure. By cutting UNRWA funding, Trudeau is collectively punishing innocent Palestinians in Gaza and Palestinian refugees across the occupied West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. This decision means Canada is politicizing humanitarian funding for Palestinians while destabilizing the UN system in order to achieve the broader goal of unconditional support for Israel. And it follows the dangerous precedent set by Harper in 2010, where he also cut funding to UNRWA. Today, Canada stands shoulder to shoulder, unconditionally and uncritically, with Israel as it enacts its war of revenge on Gaza. It's Israel's war on hospitals, schools, churches, and mosques. It's Israel's war on the elderly, disabled people, on women, men, and children. It's a war against international law and norms and human decency. And as we know, during times of crisis, it's women and children who suffer the most. Since October 7th, Israel has killed over 30,000 Palestinians in Gaza, 70% of whom are women and children. Israel has killed an average of 63 women every day, and 1 child every 10 minutes. Every day, Israel kills an average of 37 mothers in Gaza. Breastfeeding babies are dying of malnutrition because their mothers are starving and unable to produce breast milk. In northern Gaza, 1 in 6 children is acutely malnourished. Women are eating less and less often to save food for their children and for their families. Ending the genocide in Gaza is a feminist issue. Canada's decision to cut UNRWA funding is the prioritization of politics over innocent people, and it shows Canada's lack of serious commitment to our own feminist international assistance policy. So, is Canada back? Has Trudeau reclaimed Canada's compassionate and constructive voice in the world? If you ask the majority of Canadians who want a ceasefire, or the thousands of Canadians protesting every week since the start of Israel's war on Gaza, or starving women in Gaza who will be directly impacted by Canada's cuts to UNRWA, you might get the same answer. Today, I have the privilege to use my voice to speak on behalf of the women in Gaza who are not able to be heard. I'm calling on Prime Minister Trudeau and the Canadian government to reclaim Canada's compassionate and constructive voice in the world. Prime Minister Trudeau, will you restore funding to UNRWA, a lifeline for Palestinians in Gaza facing a genocide, and ensure that we put the lives of innocent people over politics? And will you call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, not via a joint statement with New Zealand and Australia, not via a UN vote, but with your own words, standing in front of Canada and the world as you did nearly a decade ago when you declared with conviction that Canada was back? I challenge you to make the moral choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Lama. I would now like to introduce Nihad Jasser, a Palestinian Canadian who is a project management professional public servant and a proud mother of 4.
All right. So good morning, everybody. I would like to first begin by reaffirming and acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. Acknowledgement represents the first step to reconciliation for all those whose land has been stolen. I would also like to state that my opinions and statements are those of my own and that I am not speaking on behalf of the Government of Canada. So, let me paint a picture to you, a family, a mother who had her own house, her own kitchen, and her sanctuary. She's surrounded by her family, laughter, fighting, all the sounds that make a house a home. Then going from being a homeowner to owning nothing, to being a stat and a number. You go from a home to a tent with your small children, your teenagers, your family, whoever it may be. Just imagine what that is like. No running water, no electricity, no sewage, no warmth, no safety. Imagine that mom giving birth to a small child, and she uses warm water bottles to try to keep that child warm. But despite all her efforts, that child dies, and they die from malnutrition. You would think that the situation that I just described is something that's a reflection of today's events by the apartheid state of Israel. But today's events are nothing but a repeat of these events happening over and over again to the people of Palestine. And through all this, the women of Palestine remain steadfast. Their enduring strength lies solely in their unwavering hope for a better future. And that specific scene that I just painted for you is actually my grandmother's story from 1948. So, the Palestinian women's struggle with the apartheid state of Israel did not just start, it is 76 years old. So on this day of International Women's Day, I sit in the comfort of my home, in the safety that I live in. And I wonder, how can I, as a Palestinian woman, how can I adequately convey their experiences and celebrate them? I can share the stats with you and numbers, but I am a firm believer that we are not numbers. Whether it's 1 or 1 million, you must stand up for women and girls. So let us stand up for the women being arbitrarily detained in jails. These women have been physically abused and have faced various forms of sexual abuse, which constitute grave violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. Let us stand up for the women who were shot dead when they tried to recover their child's dead body lying in the street because he was killed by settler violence or Israeli soldiers on their way back home from school. Let us stand for the women that are forcibly shaken awake in the middle of the night by Israeli soldiers that then made them stand by to watch as they beat their husbands, shoot their sons, and detain their daughters. And a quick note here, children as young as 12 have been detained in Israeli prisons. Let us stand up for the women living through the genocide in Gaza today that are trying to find food and water for their children when their stomachs hurt from the pangs of hunger and dehydration. And let us stand up for the women of Gaza who have had to endure and continue to endure the heartbreaking experience of giving birth to premature babies only to watch them struggle in the incubators. In the West, we advocate for women's rights and strive to ensure they are respected and liberated. However, it is the Palestinian women that embody respect and liberation. Their perseverance, courage, love, strength, tears, All right. So, their perseverance, courage, love, strength, and tears teach us invaluable lessons. So, on this day, we express our gratitude and celebrate these exceptional women who, despite facing numerous challenges, continue to persevere. But today, we will not celebrate as usual. On this International Day for Women, on March 8, 2024, as the genocide in Gaza continues, we echo what thousands and millions have been asking for more than 150 days. Canada must exert pressure on Israel to thoroughly investigate instances of rape and sexual assault against Palestinian female detainees. I'm not a public speaker.
Speak from the heart.
So, Canada must end its complicity in starving the Palestinians in Gaza and must condemn Israel's violations of international laws. Canada must immediately end all arms trade with the apartheid state of Israel, and Canada must honor the ICJ ruling and pressure Israel to a ceasefire and end the genocide on the Palestinians in Gaza. From the river to the sea, free Palestine.
Thank you so much, Nihad, and thank you to all of our speakers for telling us a little bit more about the gendered impact of the genocide in Gaza. Today, Justice for All Canada has a report detailing in more details what's going on. So just to summarize, we call on the Canadian government to acknowledge and condemn the gendered violence committed against women and girls in both Gaza and the West Bank. Israeli forces should be mentioned as perpetrators of these grave crimes. It has been over a month since the ICJ ordered Israel not to commit acts of genocide. Despite this fact, the killing and human rights violations continue. Canada must urgently take a leadership role in ending these injustices and utilize diplomatic pressure to secure a permanent and unconditional ceasefire. And lastly, Canada must immediately restore funding to UNRWA, a critical humanitarian organization for Palestinians. Thank you.
Please conclude the press conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.